It was the best of ochres. It was the worst of ochres.
Hey guys, today I'm purifying ochre. About a year and a half ago, I went and collected this ochre near the San Pedro River, and then it just sat in a bag out here in my workshop because I didn't have any pressing need for red paint at that time. If you haven't seen that video, I'll put the link to it right up here in case you're interested. Now since then, I went and collected red ochre in a different location in the Sierra Ancha mountain near some ruins. Now, I also made a video about that, and I'll put the link to that right up here as well. So I'm going to compare these two forms of ochre from different places in Arizona and talk about their working properties, and then I'm going to talk about how I'm purifying this.
No. Pretty Caroline, stone cold stunner. She was a winner, started working at the dime.
I discovered this San Pedro Valley ochre way back when I was like 19 years old. And so I've been using it to make potteries for years and years and years. And it's really good stuff. It's solid. This was the first ochre I ever found, and really, it's still my go-to. It comes between layers of shale. So there's a lot of layers of like shale out there, and then there'll be these thin layers of red ochre, really bright in between them. It takes a lot of effort to collect it because you've got to kind of dig it out, make sure you don't get rock materials and other layers of stuff that are in there. So that's what I'm doing today, is kind of sorting out bits of shale and such from the really good red stuff. Now the best thing about this ochre that I found over the years is that it has some clay-like properties. It goes on really nice when it's painted on the outside of a pot, but then it hardens in the fire. This little mug is a great example of this San Pedro ochre that is painted on the outside of a pot and then polished up nice and turns a nice bright red, and like I said, hardens well. So a lot of ochre will just leave a chalky residue on the outside of a pot if it's not somehow made fast. When I collected this ochre from these Sierra Anchas, I had hopes that it would have a similar quality because it was also found between layers of shale and it seemed very fine, but it did not. I've used it several times now, and each time the red paint is fugitive after the firing. This was the first pot I made in which I used that ochre from the Sierra Anchas. And any place that it didn't get polished, it's a little bit fugitive. Not a lot fugitive, but a little. Places where I polished it good, it's not fugitive at all. So once you run it over with that polishing stone, it makes it fast. But like in this little nook in between the two lobes of this jar, I just had trouble getting that polishing stone in there, so I thought, I'm just gonna skip polishing it and it's gonna be fine, and it's not. It comes off a little bit. So that was my first run with it, but I still tried it again because I thought, well, maybe I didn't quite fire it hard enough, maybe it was, maybe there were some extenuating circumstances in the way I used it. So I've tried it since then on 2 other pots, and the results are always the same. So it's really not going to be a good go-to ochre for me because it doesn't harden in a fire like that San Pedro ochre. So for example, I put that San Pedro ochre on here and I polished it all really well. It's polished all over. But there's always places you don't hit with your polishing stone, like places up under this handle where I didn't get polished very well. It's not fugitive. Or places inside the mouth of the jar. It's not fugitive. So it's a good solid red ochre that I can use as not truly a slip, but more what they call a hematite wash. Just adding that pigment to the base clay. Now if you look at the colors of these two, you'll see that they're very similar. The San Pedro source is a little redder, and the Sierra Ancha source is a tiny bit oranger. And I think that's true on the pots as well. The Sierra Ancha ochre is a little oranger, maybe even a little brighter than the San Pedro version. So I've gone through the bag of material that I collected out there that day, and I've sorted it into 3 piles. In the bowl here is the really pure stuff, the really good, really red and soft material. In the pile here, it's the less quality material, little chunks that are really hard or are mixed with bits of shale. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this, but I might try grinding it up and using it, or I might try picking out the better bits, I don't know. I might just throw it away too. I'm still kind of torn on what to do with it. I just hate throwing out a good material, especially when you hike 5 miles in to get it. And then the rest of this is pretty much just junk. Bits of shale, little bits of really hard, not very red material. And I think I'm just gonna throw this out. So maybe close to a quarter of the material I collected, I'm not gonna keep. And maybe a third of it is good enough to use the way it is. So last week, as an experiment, I took some of this San Pedro ochre and I just soaked it in water. I let it sit there for, I don't know, 12 hours or so. And then I just crushed it up with my hands, stirred it up with water, and then poured off those red particles that were suspended. I levigated the material without crushing or grinding it, just breaking it up by hand in the water. And what I came out with was these flakes of purified ochre. Really nice, really red, and really consistent with this material that I processed from the same site some years back. So this was just poured off the top. But this is all I could get out of it before it started, not suspending a lot of particles. That's not very much. Although red ochre, as used as a pottery paint, goes a long way. It really doesn't take very much to give a red color to your clay. With this much ochre, I know I can do a lot better than what I have here. So today I'm going to try grinding this up in my corn grinder and then levigating it after it's ground, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot more. My question, though, is it going to be as red as the stuff that I just was able to soak off? Or if grinding it up with this other material, and a lot of it kind of light-colored, is going to lighten it, which I really don't want. I don't want it to be pinker. I want it to be redder, if anything. So I can always go out and get more, but my question is, does grinding it tend to make it pinker because of this lighter colored material, which isn't in thick layers and isn't even clay-like. I think the white material is shale-like, is hard. So theoretically it won't suspend, but I don't know. Once it's ground up, am I making smaller particles that will suspend? So that's kind of what I'm looking at here, because what I want is material like this, which, like I said, I purified years back. So I don't want to run out of this. But I want it as red as possible, like these flakes I got last week. So let's grind this up and levigate it and see what we can do, because that really is the best way to process this ochre. Then when I need it, I can just take a little bit of this and I can soak it in water and have paint in no time. Okay, this has settled a little bit. It doesn't look like it because it's got like a froth on the top. But as soon as I pour through that, I'm sure you'll see that the water that I'm pouring off, although it's not completely clear, it's mostly clear. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour this back into the original container and then agitate it again and then pour it again, because most of the pigment has settled already in this. I mean, it's not, like I said, it's not clear water. And before I'm done, I will let it settle all the way down to clear water. So I'm going to stir this up, and I can't stick my hand in here to stir it because it's so full. So I'm just using this trowel to stir it up a little bit, just to agitate it so those particles of pigment become suspended in the water, and then before they have a chance to settle, pour them again into the settling container. And I will just keep repeating this procedure over and over again for the next couple of hours until the material in here is mostly grit, and the material in here is all those very fine pigment particles. So I've repeated this process numerous times that I didn't show you because it gets a little tedious. How do you know when to quit? I could keep doing this forever. Let me show you. This has settled out pretty well. And I'm pouring it into the bucket with the grit. And you can keep going. You can keep going and get diminishing returns because you're always picking up some pigment. But at some point you get to the point where even when you stir it up, the water stays relatively clear. It's not thick like it was at first. I can still see down at least a 1/4 inch in this, even as it's stirred, which means there's just not that much, which shows us that there's just not that much suspended sediment in it anymore. And so, yes, you can keep going and still get some out of it, but you're not getting much. So at this point, I'm going to call it good. I'm going to let this dry out so I can put it in a jar and store it for future use. And I'm going to let this dry out. I'm going to let the particles settle, and then I'm going to pour the clear water off the top. And then I'm going to let this dry out. And then when it's fully dry, I'm going to grind it again as fine as I can. And then I'm going to go through this process again, and I'm going to get more particles out of it. Because to continue this levigation process is really not buying me much. But in the grit that's in the bottom of this, there are still pigment particles that I can use. I just have to get them loose. Okay, so the bucket with the purified hematite, the purified ochre, is going to be allowed to dry until it is like this. And then I will put it in a jar like this and be able to use it on pottery. It can be used as a paint, to paint designs. It can be used to slip whole areas of the pot. Let's say you're out there collecting ochre and you come across some of this ochre that, like the material from the Sierra Anchas, does not harden in firing. It is possible. In fact, it is likely. What can you do with it? Well, it's not unusable. Take this pot, for example. That I used on the bottom, that was all polished in, is not coming off, right? It was burnished into the clay body, and therefore it's fast. The other thing you can do is add enough clay to your ochre that it will harden in the firing, and that you can get by with 15 or 20% clay. So let me show you what I've been trying. This is some red clay that I collect near Tucson. It fires fairly red, but as you can see, it's a lot darker than ochre, right? It's not as bright. It's not as red. And that's as bad as red as you can get. So with this pot, I mixed about 20% of this red clay with about 80% of that ochre I got from the Sierra Anchas. And you can see that it fired a nice bright red. So that's one way to handle it. Then I didn't have to worry about polishing it all in, because there were places like under the tail or around the neck where I didn't polish it all that well, because these appendages are kind of fragile and I didn't want to put too much stress on them and get them to crack before they were fired. So by mixing it with a little bit of clay, I was able to use it just like a slip, and it came out real good. So that's the other thing you can do if you do have one of those ochres that doesn't harden in the firing. It's still usable. If you're interested in learning more about using natural pigments to make paints and slips for your pottery, I have a whole online masterclass that delves deep into the types of minerals you can find, where you can find them, how you can process them and use them for slips, paints, and decorations on your pottery. And so I think if you're interested in natural pigments for pottery, this would be a really great way for you to learn the whole story about it. Much more in depth than I'm going to go into in a YouTube video. And that's on my website at ancientpottery.how, and I'll put the link to that class down in the doobly-doo in case you're interested. I hope you learned something today and enjoyed this video about red ochre and processing red ochre to make paints and slips for pottery. If you did, give me a thumbs up so I know you liked it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.